right now, you should go to patreon.com/unregistered and become a patron of this show. When you do that, you will have access to roughly half of the episodes of Unregistered. You can also see the weekly Unreported news analysis show with me, regular AMAs, and you'll have access to Thursday night's Unregistered Live Zoom meetings with me. But at the Unregistered Academy level, you can take all of our courses. We already have 5 on the books that you can watch right now, and we have multiple live interactive webinars coming up throughout the summer. So again, go to patreon.com/unregistered and become a patron right now. I'll see you in class. This is the Unregistered podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. This is a show about ideas, people, and behaviors that are considered inappropriate, out of bounds, or beyond the pale. The things you're not supposed to talk about if you're a school teacher, a college professor, a businessman, a politician, a parent, a neighbor, or even a podcast host. These are the things you're not supposed to say or even think if you're a good liberal, a good conservative, or a good citizen. Each week, I'll interview a person who has something bad to say. They might be a journalist or a professor. They might be a porn star or a drug dealer. They might just be an ordinary person with an ordinary job who doesn't care about the rules of polite society. I'm not interested in breaking the rules just to be a troublemaker. I'm interested in people who break the rules of conventional thought and to expand the scope of what is possible to say in our society. I'm interested in people who make me think. We all now know that wearing masks doesn't stop COVID, social distancing doesn't stop COVID, nor do lockdowns. What will stop COVID, or any pandemic like it in the future from happening, is to stop a secret part of American foreign policy from happening. This is what I hope will be a historic interview with Sam Husseini. I am joined from Maryland, outside of Washington, D.C., the center of all that is good in the world, by Sam Husseini, who I have been trying to get on this show for how long is it? many months, Sam.
I haven't been ducking you.
I know.
I'm excited and delighted to be with you.
Awesome. I think this episode could be historic. At least I hope it is. I think if people listen to it and act on it, I think it will change the world, frankly. So that's my hope here. Why Sam came on this show, or I asked him to be on the show, is that many months ago, I don't even know what it was, but I suddenly realized that there is a strong possibility, or I knew that there was a strong possibility, that COVID emerged from bioweapons research at Wuhan or a lab like that. And then it occurred to me that the most sensible, practical answer to the COVID pandemic is to stop bioweapons research. and I noticed that no one was talking about it. And I searched and I looked, and I think I put a thing on Twitter, and I asked some friends who were in the anti-war movement, has anybody done anything on this? And the answer from everyone was Sam Husseini. So I reached out to you, and then you attended some of our courses, and which was amazing. And we had some courses on foreign policy, and you were tremendous in that. And so we've been trying to set this up as a date, and we finally did it. But since in the meantime, you've been writing stuff about Madeleine Albright and other issues, but I really want to focus and hone in on this today, because I've never seen all the information and evidence and argumentation sort of put together in one place. And that's what I want to do now. So here's what I want to do. I want to have you state your thesis, point to the major pieces of evidence that support your thesis. And then I want to go to the history of bioweapons research from the 1940s to the present. And at the end of that history, we will flesh out some of the details of the last 2.5 years. Is that fair?
I'll do my best.
Okay.
I'll do my best, and I'll try to interweave it with, insights that I've had along the way that brought me here. I mean, I did a lot of work on Iraq WMDs that informed this.
Right.
Nuclear weapons policy that informed this. But
right.
that
Yeah,
sounds good.
let's talk about first who you are before we do that. So I've been involved with what's called the anti-war movement for decades at this point, and it's a fairly small community made up of basically socialists and libertarians, and I'm sort of neither, but I've always been close with almost everyone in that movement. And you're part of that movement. You come from that movement, but from the left. You're a man of the left, are you not?
I'm a man of the left, but I've always been very receptive to working with people who identify as being from the right, and even put out a voting strategy along those lines. But yes, absolutely.
Yeah,
a sort of merger of the left and right in an anti-establishment rubric. But yeah,
right. And most of your writing appears in left-wing outlets.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, with the exception of antiwar.com. I think I wrote for the American Conservative once. But yeah,
right.
Yeah.
But mostly it's for places like Consortium News and Counterpunch and Salon, which I didn't even know was still around. I wrote for Salon a long time ago. So yeah, okay, good. Now we know who you are. You're an independent journalist. You do this stuff essentially in your free time, right?
Well, sort of. I mean, my day job is, and not associated with this conversation, is with a Institute for Public Accuracy, and I get out information there, and that lets me talk to different experts on different issues. So it's been beneficial in that I talk to different people, analysts, legal experts, weapons experts, and so on. So that's sort of informed where I've come to. But increasingly, I can't honestly get published anywhere, and I reluctantly set up a Substack on did that whole song and dance, because a lot of when you're trying to pursue the truth, you're not necessarily rooting for a team, and you're not going to mesh with the narrative that the socialists necessarily want, or the libertarians necessarily want, or anybody else. You become independent, and that can be a great thing, and it can be a very difficult thing.
Well, so I think the reason why you're being shunned by the media is that, and people will see in an hour or so, they will know what I'm talking about. If you are right about this, if you are right, and people find out about it, if large numbers of people find out about it and act on it, I mean, I have not said this to anyone on this show ever. It really does have revolutionary potential. I mean, I think that if you're right and people act on it, what you're saying here, governments could fall. Governments could fall. So there's just so much at stake. I mean, there's more at stake here in this issue than I think anything I've ever covered. Anything, because it's just, we're talking about mass death. We're talking about governments potentially behind it. But let's get into it. So what's your thesis?
Let's get into it.
And what's the major evidence? The major evidence. And don't get bogged down in the details. We'll do that at the end. But the major evidence.
Well, the major evidence is partly what people think about when they think of evidence and when they think about science. So when it became apparent that the Wuhan Institute of Virology was right there, a lot of the so-called scientific establishment immediately said, well, there's no evidence. Well, what do you mean by evidence? The fact that the lab is near the outbreak is evidence. It may not be definitive evidence, but people have this idea of science, and I think I'm partially informed here by I was a math major, and philosophy, logic, and computation at Carnegie Mellon. I mean, I'm so I'm not intimidated by this. Science is supposed to be, about observable evidence and using reason, and people. And I think especially people on the liberal left have this sort of deference to the white lab coats and the technical jargon, and it's become looked upon as a priesthood or something. So right there from the get-go, that's a piece of evidence. And when the so-called scientific community says there's no evidence, that right there is wrong. There is evidence. It's not definitive, but that's a piece of evidence, very serious piece of evidence. There are a number of theses. A major thesis that I put forward early on that I think has been completely validated at this point is that there was a concerted effort by the elements of the so-called scientific community to cover up the fact that a lab origin was a genuine possibility. This was spearheaded by Peter Daszak, who is head of EcoHealth Alliance, who funded the work in Wuhan as a subcontractor for the NIH. He also, I documented in 2020, got even more money that nobody was covering virtually. He got even more money from USAID, which has been known to be a quasi, sort of a soft power CIA thing. It's run out of the State Department. What the hell are they doing funding all of this dangerous lab work? And the Pentagon. He got, about $40 million from the Pentagon over the years, and about $60 million from USAID. And there was no coverage of that. It was all talking about the NIH, talking about Fauci, and so on. So he puts out a piece in the Lancet, a letter, which is disguised as a statement of solidarity.
And when is this?
This is February of 2020.
Right.
February 11th. Puts out a statement saying, a statement of solidarity with the frontline workers in Wuhan. We're with you as you're fighting this pandemic, a long-winded statement at the very end. And we denounce these conspiracy theories that it might have come out of a lab. Well, what the hell is that doing there? And then I started digging into who the other scientists were who signed this. And none of the other ones were identified as being with EcoHealth Alliance, but one of the other ones was a vice president of the organization. Several of them were board members. Others were part of what they call this One Health initiative, and they all share funders. So I'm like, okay, this isn't a objective scientific assessment, even though it's gotten all of this media play. This is akin to a clique or even a cabal. I mean, it reminded me a lot of the so-called neocons during the buildup of the Iraq invasion and before, that very closely associated people share funding, share an ideology, and so on. So, so that was one chunk of it. And I still have pieces in the works looking at each of the scientists. There was similarly a Nature Medicine article that came out with similar issues that purported to prove that it wasn't a lab construct. And when I went to people, I should say people who influenced me in this. I don't know if you or your listeners are familiar with Francis Boyle. He's a professor of law at the University of Illinois. He actually wrote the US implementing legislation for the Biowarfare Convention. US signed the Biowarfare Convention in 1972. We'll go back further if you like, with Nixon. And then in 1989, they ratified the treaty unanimously. The Senate ratified the treaty that Boyle wrote. And he's very proud of that. And he's a staunch opponent of the death penalty. So if anybody makes and kills people with biological weapons, they will not be subject to the death penalty because Francis Boyle wouldn't let it in his law. So
and Boyle and Boyle is very much on record saying that he believes firmly, right, that this is a lab origin. COVID is lab.
It was funny to me. I think that he's the first person that I thought, I got an email from him in late January saying somebody ought to check if there's a lab in Wuhan. And then the next day, and I didn't bother doing it. I didn't bother doing it. And the next day he did the search, found out that there was, and emailed to this little list of biowarfare people he has, and just said, bingo, there is.
Just pause there for a second. Both of you guys, the two of the leading experts on this issue, you didn't even know that there was a lab in Wuhan when you found out about COVID.
Yeah, no.
But you just assumed that there had to be a lab, and you're right. I mean, that's incredible. I didn't know that. That's incredible.
I mean, that's Francis. I mean, I've done some work on this, but I certainly don't have the expertise that Francis has. I've been a generalist, mostly focusing on foreign policy, some work on a fair amount of work on weapons of mass destruction. But my day-to-day work is sort of juggling different issues.
Right.
So and then I connected with Meryl Nass, and another part of this history is the anthrax attacks of 2011 that have largely gone down the memory hole. People might recall, or for the benefit of your younger listeners, who shortly after the 9/11 attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, there were the anthrax attacks, which sort of made the fear and terror of 9/11 a national phenomenon.
So people who don't know about this, as I remember it, anthrax was mailed in the mail to certain, was it Congress people?
It was Congress people. It was members of the media. Some of them were actual, very finely, high toxicity anthrax, and some of them were fake, just a harmless white powder. And it was interesting as to who got which, but I'll leave that aside for the moment. So the people who I had touched base with on that were Francis Boyle and a leading expert on anthrax, Dr. Meryl Nass, who's a very independent-minded doctor based in Maine. She was a fairly mainstream person. She got mainstream media coverage during the 2001 anthrax attacks because she was, she uncovered apparently the only known proved use of biological weapons in the post-World War II era, that elements associated with the Rhodesian government used anthrax against Black farmers in, I believe, the 1960s. And she proved that like a decade or two later.
Wow.
So leading expert of anthrax. So when the anthrax attacks happened, they were depicted as coming from nefarious Arabs or Muslims. They were a false flag. They had, writing scrawled on them, praise to Allah, death to America, death to Israel, you die now. And, that you had liberal luminaries like Andrew Sullivan at that point calling for nuclear war because a Rubicon has been crossed. They, quote unquote, have escalated matters to this point, and we have to think about things that we would never have thought about before. That was the liberal response. So you had this mass fear in Congress and throughout the country, and it was at that point that the Bush administration used that fear to get the Patriot Act and start the first of the invasion of Afghanistan. And then there were later biological weapons fears associated with the invasion of Iraq in 2003. So those were the people that influenced me early on, that were the first to alert me as to the possibilities here. And like Meryl Nass, for example, pointed out the Nature Medicine article that discounted the possibility of laboratory construct was fallacious in its scientific reasoning.
Okay, so what's the connection between the anthrax false flag? By the way, so let's just state this. It's been, I think he's convicted, right? I mean, it's been basically proven that it originated, the anthrax attack came from a federal government employee. Is that right?
The FBI tried to pin it on 3 people. The case fell apart with the first 2, and the third one, he died of an alleged suicide.
Okay.
So there was never a trial. They never proved their case. Then FBI head Robert Mueller, later famous for other reasons, was brought before the Senate finally in 2008. And Patrick Leahy, one of the targets of the anthrax letters, told him to his face, "I don't buy this. There's no way one person did all of this." And that's where the matter stood. The House actually, Rush Holt, who's no longer in Congress, introduced a bill to investigate this on the 10th anniversary of the anthrax attacks, and that never moved forward. So it's never been meaningfully investigated. The evidence is that it came from a US or US allied lab.
Right.
The FBI pinned it on this one, quote unquote, lone person, Bruce Ivins, who they claimed did it to increase fear of anthrax so that he would get more funding. So that's an interesting.
Which is, and that's the connection between anthrax and COVID, potentially, right? Is that a lot of bioweapons research followed the anthrax attacks. Is that right?
Absolutely.
Okay.
There could be several connections between the two, and we can get into layers of that. Ooh. But one connection is that after the anthrax attacks, there was a huge spike in spending of bioweapons work, even though the bioweapons related programs were what caused it. It's completely an example of, of the most vicious of circles. It's like saying, US interventionism in the Middle East causes a resentment. Let's go invade some more countries to help solve the problem.
Exactly.
Right. So it's a similar dynamic.
Okay. So that's the anthrax piece. Okay. So we've got Daszak. Yeah, we've got Daszak, getting these scientists to all insist that didn't come from the lab. We have the anthrax connection. And what are the other major pieces of evidence before we get into the history?
Well, let me finish with the, Meryl Nass pointed out to me that after the Lancet letter, there was a Nature Medicine article. And I'm still, I would encourage people to subscribe to my Substack, because there will be more. There will be more.
Yes.
But there are, what Meryl pointed out to me was this Nature Medicine article, which got even bigger pickup than the Lancet letter, that said it couldn't be a laboratory construct. New York Times, everybody, and the media mantra at the time were, sorry, conspiracy theorists, no dice here, you're all nut jobs, da 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 da. So Meryl pointed out to me, this Nature Medicine article doesn't add up. They're not proving what they claim that they're proving. She even questioned whether or not the people who signed it actually wrote it, meaning that some government scientists wrote it, and these scientists were instructed to put their names on it. And there's been some evidence that's come out since then that may well have been part of what happened. These scientists, FOIAs since that time have shown discussions between them and Fauci, where some of these scientists were initially saying, apparently, this could have come out of a lab. And then after a discussion with Fauci, they changed their tune and signed this paper. So that's a chunk of the story. So with that insight from Meryl Nass, I approached Richard Ebright, who's a very mainstream figure, probably the leading expert on biolab issues. He's a professor at Rutgers. And he responded and said, yeah, this article doesn't make sense. This article is not, the way that he put it is, it's an opinion piece. It should be in the New York Times. It's not a scientific paper, even though everybody was treating it as a scientific paper. So I posit, and I think it's proven at this point, that there was a concerted attempt to pretend that lab origin couldn't be what caused this pandemic, a massive propaganda campaign. It largely came out of these scientific circles of these scientists who get this funding, this massive funding that happened after 9/11 that funds this work. In 2005, there was a letter that 700 scientists wrote to the NIH, pleading with them, saying, "You're killing our field. You're distorting the scientific field because of your funding patterns. You're encouraging us to do certain work that's not called for for scientific reasons because it fits, a different agenda." And it was Fauci who responded to them. I mean, Fauci's been at his job for longer than most Americans have been alive.
That's right.
And Fauci basically told these scientists, the American people, through their elected representatives, that's the Bush-Cheney administration he's referring to, have told us that they want this work done. Now, we can have a seat at the table, or this work can be done through other means. What I think that he was talking about there was basically, we want to fund ourselves, don't we, guys? And if we don't do this work, then it'll be done through Fort Detrick, the main U.S. so-called biodefense facility, and other U.S. government facilities, and we won't see a slice of this action. So put on your big boy pants and get to it. So we're not seeing science here. We are seeing the political economy of science, the militarized political economy of science. It's not science. It's using science, the same way Jerry Falwell uses religion, or what, whoever you want to talk about. Anybody can do anything, based on a pretext of something that might have good attributes, but that's not what we're talking about here.
Okay.
So I turned to Ebright. He said this article doesn't add up, and I tried. Nobody on the left would touch this. Go down the list of progressive publications and people I published with before and been on their shows before, and no one would touch this. One person that I reached out to, who I'd published with a little bit, was Salon, and they, ironically, when everybody else became completely calcified about this, when Trump finally talked about this in April, and when he floated the possibility that it came from a lab, then what was a huge problem turned into a complete disaster with everybody liberal. Okay, now it's a Trump idea, so now it's a completely crazy notion. But ironically, that grabbed Salon's attention, and they published my first piece after that, because they at least saw that it was a story, and perhaps they sensed that that they realized that this was a problem, that just because Trump says something doesn't mean that it's false. Right. And that's how the so-called left lazily conducted itself for so long. So, and then I followed up with another piece. Part of what informed me in looking at this was, I just did a history of lab leaks. Okay, now I avoid using the term lab leak. I say lab origin because I'm trying to be very careful.
Yep.
Lab leak implies mistake. This might well be a mistake. That's been Francis Boyle's operating hypothesis. Occam's razor. There's a lab there. It could be a mistake. But as the anthrax attacks show us, you can have a false flag. You can have people get framed for things, and I'll fill you in on some further evidence along those lines later on, I guess.
So you were talking about your Salon piece, and the left would ignored it because it was associated with Trump's thesis or suggestion. And then what came out of that piece, or what was in that piece? Is that?
Yeah, well, I wrote down some of what I've told you, and well, and at that point, then, outlets like Democracy Now!, for example, at that point, they actually had Peter Daszak on,
Yeah,
Um,
amazing.
and and
Amazing.
the headline on their piece was something like, scientist debunks Trump's conspiracy theory.
Yeah, they had him on.
And
They had him on to debunk what you're saying, right? To
right,
support him. To support him, Peter
to
Daszak.
support him, and they framed it as, Mr. Daszak, you work with these people. This couldn't happen, right? Rather than saying, hold on, you're an interested party.
Right.
Um, maybe we should ask you some tough questions here. It was
Yeah.
completely, this just Trump hatred blinding people to the evidence literally right in front of them, all in the name of science.
So let's lay out. Sorry, let's. I was going to ask you this. Let's lay out the basic circumstantial evidence, right? So, like, what exactly is EcoHealth Alliance? How much money did they spend? Where did they get the money from? And what were they doing? What's been happening with EcoHealth Alliance?
Right. Well, the main initial piece of evidence, there's been a lot of circumstantial scientific evidence that's come out in the 2 years since, and I'm probably not the best person to break that down. Several people who are Jonathan Latham at Independent Science News. He's a virologist and has done a ton of work on. I found that a lot of people who did work on GMOs get this. It's a subject that I did not do much work on at all.
Interesting.
But they understand that the life sciences can and have been corrupted. So you have the Organic Consumers Association has done a ton of work on this. They have they profiled a bunch of the scientists involved, as I've done as well. U.S. Right to Know, which did a lot of FOIAs on GMO issues and is now doing a lot of FOIAs on this. Andrew Kimbrell of the Center for Food Safety similarly did a lot of work on GMOs and is similarly doing a lot of work on this. So just to say, over the last 2 years, a lot of scientific analysis has further buttressed the case that it could have come from a lab, and no scientific analysis has buttressed the case that it didn't come out of a lab. That is, the initial mantra was it came out of the Wuhan wet market. Well, subsequent scientific analysis found that the earliest cases were not the ones that were associated with the wet market. That is, it was circulating for some time before it hit the so-called wet market. So it's difficult to prove with absolute certainty, but the accumulating levels of evidence are pointing in the direction of some kind of lab origin. The famous furin cleavage site, which is what helps COVID latch on to human respiratory system, apparently is not typically found in coronaviruses, implying that it was attached from something else in there. Boyle, and this is separate from my level of expertise, pointed that out early and pointed out that there were alleged strands of HIV in there. Luc Montagnier, who is credited with discovering HIV, this French scientist who unfortunately died not too long ago, similarly made similar assessments. Okay. There are strands that are typically associated with having done genetic work, like whatever it is, CCC, GGG, like you get those, in order to, as part of a genetic manipulation process. And they have apparently been found associated with the furin cleavage site sequence. That implies that there's some genetic manipulation going on here. Jonathan Latham has connected this with work that he's found in China. One of the theses is that it came out of the Mojang mine, that there was several miners died or I can't remember if they died or they became incredibly sick. I believe in 2014, cleaning up that dung from a mine. And there are apparently similarities there with COVID. And so the idea being that they go out, the Xi Jinping, the so-called bat lady at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, she goes, she collects these bad viruses, she brings them to the lab. And I mean, it's possible that it could be quote unquote of natural origin. And this is something that Fauci sort of lied about. Fauci has said something like, well, if it was collected in nature and then went to the lab and was released from the lab, that's still from nature. I'm like, no, it's not. You're bringing it into a city of 11 million people.
Mm-hmm.
You're, it's like, it's like, there's a gun in a drawer. It makes a difference if I point it at my head or somebody else's head. Right. So there's that. So there's increasing pieces of evidence. Now, Xi Jinping and the Wuhan Institute of Virology also worked with US scientists. They got US funding.
Yes.
And they also worked with US scientists. And part of my Salon piece was to track that work. There was a 2015 article that was co-authored with people from the Wuhan Institute of Virology, people at Harvard, and particularly with Ralph Barrick, who works at the University of North Carolina. He apparently, my understanding of what happened is that they find the viruses, they give him to Ralph Barrick, he manipulates them in some way and see what they get. Now, this is called gain of function research. This is a euphemism. What it means is we're adding to the functionality of pathogens. We're making something that a virus either more deadly or more transmissible intentionally, ostensibly for the purpose of understanding it better so that we can learn how to fight it when nature or the terrorists spring it on us. So that goes back to, Andrew Kimbrell says, terrible term, gain of function, he calls it gain of threat. In the scientific literature, it's actually called the creation of potentially pandemic pathogens. And that was fascinating to me too early on, and it's still fascinating to me. A lot of the scientists who did a lot of work on this, warning of these possibilities, were completely silent. So when I approached people who didn't know the issue terribly well, they would say, oh, that's a conspiracy theory. When I approached people like Mark Lipsitch at Harvard, who had been warning about the potential of this kind of lab work leading to a pandemic, no response. I didn't get a response from the people in the know telling me, you're barking up the wrong tree. They just didn't want to talk. They were jumping underneath their beds because they didn't want to address this issue.
Can I cut in and just, this is something that's been sort of confusing to me for a long time. So the rationale or justification for this, as you just said, has been creating these things, and the lab helps us to understand them better when they're used when it happens from nature or the bad guys, terrorists. But if they're creating the thing, then it doesn't exist except from their creation. So I don't know what they're guarding against except their own creation. Am I missing something?
Their line is that eventually nature or the bad guys will do this.
Okay.
So we got to get ahead of them.
Okay.
Now there are a myriad of moral hazards associated with that.
That is, yeah. So like we've got to develop the nuclear bomb so that we can better understand how the Soviets will use it or something like that. Right. Okay.
Yeah, I think that's even an understatement about this, but yeah.
Right.
Now,
Okay.
I mean, one of the few times that this really came to public consciousnness was in 2011, when you had Fouchier in the Netherlands, and I always mess up this guy's name. He's at the University of uh, Wisconsin, Japanese American scientist Kawahara, I believe is how you pronounce it.
Mhm.
They both used animal passage to make the avian flu more deadly. That is, they took the avian flu, which is very deadly but
Oh,
not
yeah.
easily transmissible.
Right.
They passed it through a series of ferrets. Ferrets apparently have a respiratory system that's similar to humans. And they did this repeatedly, like a dozen times, until they distilled it so that the virus learned how to be distributed. So they didn't genetically engineer it, but they created an environment so that the virus would, it was sort of forced evolution.
And that was in Madison, Wisconsin. This thing was
That's
created.
in Madison, Wisconsin. This was created, and in the Netherlands. NIH funded it. And this guy in University of Wisconsin has also gotten Gates money and other money for far more than the NIH money. There was a bit of a furor about this at the time. The New York Times had an editorial, an engineered doomsday question mark. And part of the concern was doing the science, and part of the concern to the establishment was publishing it. Because then again, if you publish this in a scientific journal, then the terrorists could go ahead and do this. So there was some short-lived attention to these issues at the time.
Okay.
But that was quickly forgotten in terms of the general public.
Okay. So EcoHealth Alliance, which
Yes.
you seem to be identifying as the prime suspect in the origins of the COVID virus.
Well, they are clearly the prime, the initial major suspect in propagandizing the American public.
Okay.
That's established.
But
there was clearly a cover up here.
Yes.
Now, does that mean that they actually caused it, or that they just simply weren't sure, thought that they might, didn't want the possibility to be discussed, whatever it is? But there was clearly a cover up. But yes, it is quite possible that they actually caused it.
Okay, so that's what I want to talk about, exactly what they did. So first of all, what is EcoHealth Alliance? It's not a government organization. What is it?
No, it's an independent nonprofit based in New York. It gets its funding, like I say, from NIH, USAID,
and the Defense Department
and the Pentagon.
Yep.
If you go to their webpage, they're like, we get our funding from the Fish and Wildlife Service. They got like $32,000 one time from the Fish and Wildlife Service. They get their funding from the Pentagon. They get their funding from USAID.
And how much funding? Like 100 million, you're saying? About
100 million over the years from the Pentagon and USAID. And then, tidbits and pieces from, a few other government agencies, but that
from the foreign policy wing. That's the point here. From the foreign policy wing of the federal government. That's where they got money. $100 million to do this stuff. Okay.
Exactly. And so they work with labs around the world, in Africa, in Asia, in wherever. I believe they're associated with labs in Ukraine and others developing story. And so they
now, why would they do that? Why would they be developing labs in Africa and Latin America and Southeast Asia?
To collect viruses.
Okay.
So that we can have a One Health system, so that we can know when there are outbreaks among animals, so that we can protect people.
Oh, what's a One Health system?
That's the rubric of their orientation for their scientific endeavor. They call it One Health, and I believe that there's a funding institute associated with that. They are claiming that they want to track viruses. It's a surveillance system. a kind of a precursor of what
And
we're talking about
and it's
vis-a-vis COVID.
It's a central, am I right? Centralized global governance. That's what we're talking about here? That's what they're after. That's what they're aiming at.
That could well be the case.
Yeah. Okay. So it sounds like one health. Yeah. One health care system for everybody. Okay. In the world.
It's so that we, their stated goal is to, and here you get into a level of, as I say, the moral hazard. For example, they say, look, as we develop, we encroach on nature, we might come across viruses, we might unleash viruses. And there's some truth to that. And that's part of the reason we have to get ahead of this. Part of what this does is create this moral hazard, because what they're saying is, we got the silver bullet for you. So it in effect becomes a way of saying, go ahead and destroy those rainforests, because if a virus comes out of it, we got your back, because we got this silver bullet. So it actually could end up having the exact opposite effect of what it's saying the problem is. But behind all of this is the concern that you're collecting viruses and juicing them up that might kill people, and that's quite arguably, and Boyle would certainly argue, that it is a biowarfare program under a different name. You're just simply claiming that it's for defensive purposes or peaceful purposes, but that's just your statement as to what your intent is in doing this. It could just as easily be used for offensive purposes. Now, with Peter Daszak and EcoHealth Alliance, what I focused on is the politics of this. And now he ended up being named to the WHO commission to find out where the pandemic came from.
I love that. No conflict of interest whatsoever there.
It was just the most brazen, obvious conflict. He funded the work. He attempted to dismiss the possibility. He claimed that he had no conflict of interest, the most laughable possible statement. And he was appointed to this commission. Then in late 2020, he got named to head another commission. The Lancet set up a COVID commission headed by Jeffrey Sachs, who some people may know because he induced shock therapy on Russia, leading to the distorted and horrific developments there in the 1990s. So he, from his perch at Columbia, is heading the COVID commission. He appoints Daszak to head the committee of the COVID commission to, focusing on origins. I emailed Jeffrey Sachs, who I've had tangential relationships with, outlining why this is a huge problem and seeking comment from him, either on or off the record. He never got back. And that
although interestingly, hasn't Sachs changed his tune on the origins lately? Talk about that for a second. Yeah,
sure. Now, okay, I'll talk about that, and I'll set it up why that's interesting. Just in the last couple of weeks, Jeffrey Sachs put out a piece saying we really got to investigate.
That's right.
Where this came from. And he was in, I think either The Intercept or The Hill or somebody had a very cushy interview with him. Now, he's now saying what myself and Boyle and Meryl Nass or part of what we were saying 2 years, in early 2020.
Wow.
And he's saying that EcoHealth Alliance and the NIH and USAID need to be investigated, that they haven't been forthright. Now, that in a way that's welcome, if overdue. In his article, he makes no mention of the Lancet Commission. He's on a commission already doing this. He played a role in eating up the clock. again, the intro that you had for our talk here, things might still develop in a good way, but a historic opportunity was missed in 2020, right? Everybody on the planet recognized this threat to them personally and their families and their communities, and they were all told it could not have come out of a lab. We would be living in a radically different planet if they were not so misinformed and were told this may well have come out of a lab. This lab work arguably violates the Bioweapons Convention. We got a clean house, or these governments and these agencies and these corrupt scientists are potentially going to kill us all. So that didn't happen. It didn't happen because these scientists, government agencies, big media, big tech, all lied and said couldn't have come out of a lab.
Okay. This email that came out from Fauci right at the beginning of the pandemic, I think it was an email to Collins or other people at NIH, in which he's in a panic and he says, we have to have a meeting, we have to deal with this. And then they come up with that scheme, not a scheme, but a plan to discredit all those who are talking about the lab origin thesis.
Right.
So why was Fauci so nervous then? What did the NIH do with EcoHealth Alliance, and what did EcoHealth Alliance do at the Wuhan lab?
Oh, sorry, can I get to, let me just finish up with Sachs.
Totally. I'm sorry. I thought you were finished with that. Sorry. Yeah.
I mean, so there are several strands of possible investigations. I think Sachs wrote that article potentially, or at least I should say Meryl Nass recently had a posting basically saying he's looking for funding here. That's why he's changing his tune, because it's now obvious what's going on here. So he's trying to get funding. Now, the other person looking for funding, or who's gotten funding and who's trying to get congressional blessing, is none other than Philip Zelikow. Philip Zelikow was the director of the 9/11 Commission, which, if you talk to the families of 9/11 advocates, will tell you covered up a great deal of stuff relating to 9/11, especially the connection to the Saudis and so on.
Right.
People might remember that they initially floated Kissinger as the head of the 9/11 Commission. And then one of the women who had just lost her husband, or not just, because it took them like a year to finally name a commission, but not as long as they've taken them this time, Kristen Bretthauser, I think I'm pronouncing her name right, it's not my strong suit. Kristen asks Kissinger, so do you have any connections to Saudi Arabia, in particular to anybody named bin Laden? And the next day, Kissinger resigns as the head of the 9/11 Commission. And they put forward Hamilton and Keene and put Zelikow in charge of it. So Zelikow is now at the University of Virginia, and there was a New York Times piece, incredible puff piece, came out in February of this year, indicating that he might get blessings from Congress in this new commission. So there's competition as to who gets a blessing from Congress, considering Congress hasn't done a damn thing to speak of. I can get into some details of what has happened in Congress, if you like. Right. So Sachs might be gunning for money here. And Zelikow is being funded by none other than Eric Schmidt, the former head of Google. So you see a lot of big tech / surveillance tie-ins here. Google has put money into a biometric firm called Metabiota, which I also have a piece coming out on. Please stay tuned. So that there are severe tie-ins with big tech surveillance issues going on here as well. Your question, EcoHealth.
So what? Why was Fauci so nervous about this? What did he have to be nervous about? What did NIH do with EcoHealth Alliance and China in that lab? What specifically was the project? And I know this came out in the hearings when Rand Paul starts grilling Fauci, and Fauci denied that it was gain of function. So go ahead.
Right. So this is what we do know. In 2015, an article was published. It stated that the work was done with that made a coronavirus doing gain of function work. That is making a coronavirus more deadly or more viral.
Where was this article? What was the article?
It was an article published in Nature Medicine in 2015.
Okay. Oh, wow.
And it was, among the co-writers were Xi Jinping, the so-called bat lady from the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and Ralph Barrick at the University of North Carolina. That was funded by USAID, and it noted that at the time, there was a pause on government funding of gain of function work, but you could get an exemption from the NIH. And this article noted that an exemption has been granted in this case. So the NIH gave the green light for this lab work that was clearly gain of function because they gave an exemption for the pause in gain of function work to proceed, and that it was funded by the US government.
So Fauci gave them the exemption to allow them to do the gain of function research at Wuhan.
At least in 2015, we know that.
Okay.
We know that, and every indication has come out that that has continued, and that he, Ebright, you get into some technicality as to the definition of gain of function and where that line is, but Ebright has outright said Fauci was untruthful in his responses to Rand Paul's questions on this issue.
So Fauci said to Rand Paul, "Senator, you do not know what you're talking about."
Exactly.
What do you think was in Fauci's mind right then? What was it that Rand Paul didn't know?
I don't know. I think that he was pretending what the definition of gain of function was and what these alleged oversight committees that apparently never used to define what gain of function is would play games with it. I think that he might be, and this requires more and more. I've done a lot of investigation in terms of the funding patterns, but it might be, he might be playing games with the language in terms of funding. That is, it's possible that USAID provided the funding, but NIH provided the okay for the work. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, but he was denying that there was a weaponization of viruses going on.
Oh, he certainly didn't use that. He didn't use that phrase. I believe. I believe that what he said was the NIH has not funded gain of function work at Wuhan.
Oh, well done, Tony.
Okay,
it's possible.
Yeah. It's possible that other agencies have done that, or it's possible that he's pretending that gain of function means something that it doesn't mean.
Nice work there. Yeah, well, that's what he does. He's a spokesperson primarily. Okay. And then they went ahead and used tens of millions of dollars of NIH, US government, and I guess Pentagon money as well to do this in Wuhan over the last.
I don't know how much was actually spent in Wuhan. I'm saying, overall, Alliance got over $100 million, but they got labs in all kinds of countries.
Okay, this is another thing that I've been very curious about. This has to do with geopolitics. Okay, we're going to move away from the virus for a second, but why on earth would the federal government of the United States of America be working directly with the Chinese Communist Party, the government of China, to develop bioweapons? What is the politics? What's the big politics of that? And what I said at the time when I found this out, that this is a possibility, I said, oh, now we know that China is not our adversary. Maybe it looks like that the US government, at least the Democratic Party, has decided to, is this right, co-manage the world in the sort of a dual empire or something? I mean, is this essentially evidence that we are not going to war with China? In fact, we meaning the government, Democratic Party especially, are intent on working with China to govern the globe. Is that it? I mean,
that's certainly a hypothesis that
okay.
needs to be unraveled. And I'll let me talk about the hypothesis and let me talk about some historical
awesome
analogies. Probably the person that has done the most work on this is Whitney Webb. I don't know if you're familiar with her work.
Sure.
Hangout. Part of her contribution to this was emphasizing the role of these so-called games. There was a game, Dark Winter, before the anthrax attacks in 2001 that seemed to foreshadow the anthrax attacks, and there were similar games.
A game? What do you mean, like a war game?
Like a war game, but for a pandemic.
Oh, nice.
So, like you have an institution, I think Johns Hopkins has housed a couple of these where they have a meeting or a virtual meeting or whatever of all of these people saying, okay, a virus has just broken out. Okay, you play the role of the president, you play the role of the media. What do we do? How do we combat this? How do we coordinate our efforts? And it's sort of, those war games sort of answer the question as to, you can't have a conspiracy that involves this many people, quote unquote conspiracy. And you can't have a conspiracy because corporate conspiracies happen all the time, from Purdue Pharma to the tobacco companies to whatever. It's a ridiculous way to dismiss an idea. But having these games, in effect, helps train the muscles so that, all of these institutions and individuals can coordinate their, that they're all on the same page. So part of what, they get at, and this was popularized in the film, Plandemic, to some extent, as to, a global governance thing. I mean, the pandemic had, enormous, societal impacts. It empowered big tech. It basically, ended the 2000 election. People gravitated to Biden because I think he was something familiar. There were a whole series of events that came out of that. And I mean, the analogies to me are, again, when you had the nuclear weapons ban treaty in 2017, 2018, 122 countries got together, said, let's ban nuclear weapons. And there might be some legitimate criticisms of the treaty. And the group behind it got a Nobel Peace Prize. I tried to get that story out in various ways. I don't know if you're familiar with when I got dragged out of Helsinki.
Oh, yeah.
During the Trump.
That's right.
Yeah, the Trump Putin news conference. That's what I got dragged out about because I was trying to ask a question about that. I had a little piece of paper said a nuclear weapon ban treaty, but Trump was never asked.
You were committing journalism, Sam.
I was trying to commit journalism. I failed. But my point being that, I mean, you have Russia and the United States now with Ukraine allegedly at each other's throats in some respects, but in other respects, they share interests. They're like mob bosses. And, part of being mob boss is we got to make sure that violence is the coin of the realm. We don't want something else to be the coin of the realm, like whatever, vision or capacity to tell the truth or compassion or anything like that.
Or peace.
Or peace or whatever. Violence has to be the coin of the realm. So we have to maintain our so-called superpower status as the possessor of these weapons that could destroy the planet. So I think that you may well be seeing a sort of collusion between the United States and China and other countries in terms of biological weapons. You saw similar patterns with, the U.S. and say Iran, during Iran-Contra, the Reaganites and Ali North could play footsie with the mullahs. Why could they do that? Because they're talking in the same terms. They're just, the flip side of each other. So there's this crazy symbiotic. Now they can throw somebody overboard. They dealt with Saddam Hussein, but for whatever reason, they felt like he couldn't take enough orders, so they threw him overboard. So what I'm saying is, yeah, they can have a dual system or seem to have a dual system of alliance, even while, it's frenemies. I mean, it's popularized to some degree, this notion of cooperation but antagonism at the same time. So I think that's part of what we're seeing here.
Okay. So can we do the history now, which I find absolutely fascinating, and to me, I mean, the deeper history, starting in the 40s, really. I think
you might know more about this than I do.
No, I mean, I know that's not your specific realm, but we'll get into I mean, you do a lot of stuff too. We'll talk about, but so Fort Detrick was established in 1943 during World War II, and it was, I think, explicitly designing bioweapons with which to kill German and Japanese civilians and soldiers, but both. They weren't distinguishing much in those days between civilian and soldier. And Fort Detrick is still around, and it has been doing, I think, bioweapons research. I mean, no one knows for sure, of course, because it's all top secret, but I think they admit this to some extent. They've been doing some form of bioweapons research since 1943 and continue to do so today. And by the way, a lot of people who live in Frederick, Maryland, I don't know how close you are to that, but a lot of the local residents have been protesting the existence of this place ever since 1943, because there've been some outbreaks of illnesses and odd things happening among the people around there. So, which is surprising, but super surprising. So why don't you tell tell the history of Fort Detrick and how many bioweapons labs are there inside the United States now, and what's their history? When do they start?
I'll do the best that I can, and sure. There are parts of the story that I know and parts that I don't. There are at least a dozen BSL-4 labs, which is the highest level of safety lab. What's
BSL stand for?
Biosafety lab. Like a BSL-2 is basically like a dentist's office. 3 is higher, and 4 is the highest, where, air doesn't circulate out. Hazmat suits, full, like spacesuits, things, and so on. There are at least a dozen, but perhaps 24 of those in the United States. There's no, there's no regulatory structure. The Bioweapons Convention is unique in that, chemical weapons, you have the Organization for the Prevention of Chemical Weapons, and there's the IAEA for nuclear weapons. There is no international body dealing with biological weapons.
So then what is the Biological Weapons Convention then?
It just simply says you can't do bioweapons.
But is it a law? Is it international law? Is it UN?
It's a treaty. The U.S. signed the treaty in 1972, Richard Nixon, and the U.S. did the implementing legislation in 1989.
Okay.
Starting early and going forward, the parts of the story that I know are after the end of World War II, a huge bioweapons program was being conducted by Japan against China, largely. And interestingly enough, so China knows what it's like to be on the receiving end of this in a couple of different ways.
That's not coincidental, I would bet you. Yeah, right.
Yeah, absolutely. And the U.S. absorbed the Japanese program and granted effective amnesty for the Japanese official who conducted the program.
I did not know that. I did not know the U.S. took over the Japanese bioweapons program. Okay.
Effectively, because they did a lot of tests that even the United States wouldn't do on animals, on people.
Makes sense.
On all kinds of things. So they, in effect, acquired that information.
Wow.
There have been several books written on this. The one that I'm most familiar with are Nicholson Baker.
Yeah.
You're familiar with. Very fascinating writer. Who also got into the current story, but he got into it because like 10 years ago, he tried to find out, did the United States use biological weapons against China? And ultimately, he and other people like Jeffrey Kay have, argued that, yes, they did. He didn't do that. He basically said that there was probably limited use of biological weapons by the United States, but you can't prove large-scale use because the Freedom of Information Act won't let you. They're still hiding information. They're not being responsive to Freedom of Information Act, and we can't tell. So he ended up writing a book called Baseless, basically saying we need to fix the Freedom of Information Act if we want to find out questions like this. Otherwise, we'll never know with any total certainty. The funny part about that is it's a great example of insider speak. Baseless was the name of the US bioweapons program at the time. So when the Chinese at the UN would get up and say, you're using biological weapons in the Korean War, the US official would stand up and say, these are baseless charges. So it was like this inside joke to them. Anyway, so what Nicholson Baker does conclude is that the United States at least used bioweapons as a method of war, by which he means they would drop things that looked like biological weapons, bird feathers, other things, in order to get Chinese troops to pull back, because the Chinese thought that there was the very real possibility of a bioweapons attack in this manner. So it depends, in some sense, if what you mean by use, that, if you're pretending that you're using biological weapons for military advantage in order to prevent, military deployments and so on, you're kind of using biological weapons, whether or not you actually deploy them or not. So there's that question as well. Around that same time, you had the Frank Olson case. Frank Olson was a scientist at Fort Detrick, who apparently worked on or had knowledge of biological weapons. He was killed by being thrown out of a building in Manhattan. There is actually a pretty good Netflix series on this called Wormwood.
No way.
And I don't think any book is written about this case, but his son basically made it his mission in life to try to figure out the truth of this.
What's it called on Netflix?
Wormwood.
Wormwood?
Wormwood. It's a line in Revelation about, or some biblical passage about poison water or something like that.
God.
And Cy Hirsch has done some work on this. And the remarkable part about this, and it just shows you how biological weapons are sort of the third rail of this. When they finally tried to fess up in the 1970s to some of the Cold War CIA shenanigans and so on, they put out the story that this was part of the LSD experiments. And we're going to come clean and we're going to compensate his family, because what happened was we gave him LSD as part of an experiment and he had a bad reaction and he jumped out the window.
Oh.
It now appears that was a cover story. So they actually used the admission of LSD experiments as a cover story for biological weapons. Biological weapons are this incredible thing because there's massive plausible deniability, right? Oops, too bad that happened to you. I mean, I remember during the Iraq War, the Iraqis had lots of plagues hitting them. Some you could actually ascribe as a form of biological weapon. I mean, when the US, knocked out the electricity, which knocks out the water facility, and so you get cholera, that's a form of biological warfare. The Iraq had a screwworm epidemic after the first Gulf War, and I remember lots of peace activists, or not lots, but a couple of attentive peace activists had serious suspicions that this was intentional on the part of the United States. That you disperse something that's going to eat up the crop, and that's what a lot of what Fort Detrick did. It's been alleged that Lyme disease came out of U.S. labs. That they are trying to figure out ways of potentially obliterating crops and or livestock and or hurting people. And there are some examples regarding Cuba, which I won't go into here. One more plug, please subscribe to my Substack.
Yes, indeed.
More will be coming.
Indeed.
So this has been a continual threat. Part of the mindset of the establishment, I think, was with nuclear weapons, to pipe down biological weapons because they're sort of a poor man's weapon, and sort of the same with chemical weapons, right? So you sort of stigmatize biological and chemical weapons. Think Saddam Hussein, but not, because we have nuclear weapons, so we have ultimate, complete dominance. But as I say, biological weapons have this other attribute of deniability.
Yeah, bioweapons have been called the poor man's nuclear bomb.
Correct.
So poor third world countries can inflict a lot of pain on the global north, the rich countries, by using them without having to invest money in scientists to develop nuclear bombs, right?
But potentially.
Right. Okay. Which is why it's been demonized, which is why bioweapons have been demonized, because the wealthy countries don't want those poor countries to have that ability to hurt them. Right.
Okay.
So
I'm sort of saying there's two sides of the equation. There's that side of the equation.
Yep.
The other side of the equation is that they're still potentially useful to rich countries because of the deniability factor. Right. Because if the US sets off an atomic bomb, you can't hide that. But if there's an outbreak of, cholera or dengue fever somewhere, that happens to be a US opponent, oops, too bad that happened to you. So it's
how many? No, go ahead.
I mean, some people have alleged that with respect to Wuhan. What's his name? I'm mispronouncing his name. He's sort of a libertarian writer. He noted something that I hadn't noticed, which is that it came out of the lab and it hit Wuhan first, and then another main center of the pandemic early on was in Iran. So it was like, okay, so two antagonists to US power were the first two victims of this. Is that a coincidence? But it's kind of hard to assess that because, given the nature of this, you kind of knew that this thing was going to get out there and that everybody would be, would be afflicted by this. It's funny, I've been digging through some of the congressional testimony, and So the Democrats won't let anything happen in terms of hearings.
Right.
In particular, you could have a serious hearing that would have subpoena power, that could compel Peter Daszak to fork over documents, that could put him under oath, could question him. It could seriously do the same with USAID and Fauci and everybody else. This is what people like Ebright and others have been asking for. It hasn't happened. The House Republicans have had their own hearings, which don't have any of those attributes. They had one person, Asher, I think, who's had roles in in various Republican administrations, and when some Republican congressmen sort of floated the idea that the Chinese, did the pandemic intentionally as a bioweapon, and he was like, well, part of the reason I don't believe that is if it was a bioweapon and it was intentional, why wouldn't they have done it in front of Fort Detrick? Why would they distribute it in Wuhan? Which I thought was a fascinating response, in part because, okay, well, what's the reverse logic of that? Isn't the reverse logic be, well, if it did happen in Wuhan, doesn't that mean that somebody else could have planted it there? The Chinese have occasionally made that allegation.
That they were framed.
That they were framed, or that it came out of that there were military games that took place in Wuhan shortly before the pandemic.
What?
Yeah.
Oh boy.
Yeah. So they've alleged that those military games could have either brought it in innocently or been a mechanism for somebody to effectively frame them. The Chinese government, I think, one official has been saying this, not the Chinese government as a whole, but they've occasionally put that line out. And, you have, the pattern of US government of systematically lying. I did a lot of work on the Iraq WMD case. There's also the case of Operation Merlin against Iran that I should probably make very brief mention of, where the US basically tried to plant a nuclear gun on Iran as a pretext to show that Iran was developing a nuclear weapon so as to potentially attack Iran. So you have all of, it ends up, potentially being a hall of mirrors. Again, the answer to a lot of this is disclosure. And the Senate actually passed unanimously a bill saying we want the Director of National Intelligence to disclose everything regarding pandemic origins. Pelosi won't let it proceed. The House Democrats won't let it proceed. Instead, we're getting constant, this endless January 6th stuff.
That's all gonna change though. Next January, I guarantee you there will be subpoenas being issued by the new Republican controlled Congress, don't you think?
I do think, but I am concerned that that would similarly devolve into a personal attack on Biden, which might have some legitimacy, just like personal attacks on Trump may well have had some legitimacy. But rather than the critical issues. I mean, the House Republicans produced a report, and there's some good information there. And there's concerns about Chinese biowarfare efforts in that report. There's no concern about US biowarfare efforts.
Right. They want to bash China.
Correct. So you have these competing narratives that are both wrong. So
wait a minute, though. I mean, they want to bash China, certainly. I mean, I follow the MAGA movement pretty closely, and they've been talking about this stuff since the get-go. They've been talking about the lab origin thesis, and they've been talking about Daszak and Global Health Alliance, Eco Health Alliance, and all the rest of it forever. But they, of course, are anti-China hawks to the nth degree. They want maybe not war, but they want a major confrontation with China for sure, and this would be part of it. But maybe even more than China and the CCP, they've been attacking Fauci. They've been going after Fauci. They want Fauci's, well, as Steve Bannon infamously says, they want his head on a pike. Now that's not necessarily a bad thing, because Fauci's not. This is not the first crime of Anthony Fauci, and
No,
it's incredible that he's had this much power for this long, controlling the lives of so many people. But I mean,
it just depends what part of the Republicans. I mean,
yes.
like somebody like Senator Cotton, who was early on this as well.
Mhm.
He will say stuff like, our labs are good. We help humanity and develop virus and develop vaccines,
Right.
whereas the Chinese are conducting bioweapons. Now, I think that there are some Republicans who I've heard statements from who have said things like, we need to put a halt to all gain of function work until we have an adequate system for dealing with this issue.
Oh, okay.
So that is a very good and reasonable thing.
Okay. Right.
Um,
Because we need a global true convention on this. We need a global ban, don't we, on bioweapons research? And we need
that's genuinely enforceable.
that's genuinely
Right.
enforceable. And but that needs to begin with the United States, because the United States is the biggest probably producer of bioweapons.
The U.S. is the biggest producer in all likelihood, and if you talk to Francis Boyle, it was the trailblazer in finding this fake get around to say, we're not making biological weapons, we are figuring out how to prevent biological weapons by creating them. So yeah, I mean, other countries fell in suit and used that same bogus justification.
Let me read something you wrote. You said, the major media dismissed the possibility of lab origins for the first year of the pandemic. This is one of the greatest media scandals ever. It probably even eclipses the Iraq WMD scandal, which was never properly accounted for. You still hold to that?
Absolutely. And I think that each time you don't investigate something like this completely and thoroughly, you are planting the seeds for the next disaster.
And you think
I don't think that this, I don't think we would be in this jam if they had investigated the Iraq WMD scandal and held everybody accountable. If they had investigated the anthrax techs and held everybody accountable, we wouldn't be anywhere near in this bad shape.
And you think that left-wing media like Democracy Now!, The Nation magazine, dismissed the lab origin thesis or hypothesis because Donald Trump was the first one to speak it in public?
No, I think that the problem is deeper than that. I think Trump talking about it made the situation worse, but there were 2 months there before Trump opened his mouth on this issue where they did nothing.
Right.
I think it's this reverence or confusion about what science is, that science is somehow an appeal to authority. It's the guy with the big title and some degree, and I'm not going to use my own brain to figure out what's reasonable here. Just this tepidness of scrutinizing a situation. And there are, funding patterns. I mean, Bill Gates, who's, involved in a lot of this type of thing, has bought up large sections of the media. I don't know if he funds Democracy Now! Or I don't think he funds The Nation, but, The Guardian, whole swaths of the global media, not just US media, have been funded by Gates. I think that that's been an additional problem. And I think that the big tech tie-in has been an additional problem. This issue might still, but certainly in 2020, could have been a galvanizing event in human history. Where, I mean, to me, a high point was the February 15th, 2003 protests against the Iraq War. I don't know if you recall, but
I was in them.
Right.
They were huge.
Yeah, they were huge. It was, there was, this complete move to invade Iraq, and there were these protests, which I should say parts of the U.S. so-called peace movement didn't want to have happen. It came out of Europe, and an activist, Mike Zolnick, who's now an academic in Iowa somewhere sort of got the US peace movement, such as it is, to sign on to it. And so you had a global day of protest on February 15th before the US was moving towards war. And for a couple of days, it like really looked like the establishment was thrown on its heels. That you know, I mean, the New York Times even said, you know, a second superpower is born. So of course the peace movement never tried anything like that again. And so I think that you could have had that to the nth degree with this issue, because it's affecting everybody's life. And it really is literally us human beings and our existence and our way of life being threatened by the machinations of these governments and their clandestine lab work. And we're going to all come together and we're all going to stop it.
Even if COVID did not originate from bioweapons research,
right?
Don't we all want to shut that shit down immediately across the globe? Who wants that? And it's incredible that governments just carry on with this research that could kill the entire planet, and they don't talk about it and they deny anything about it. And here we are. So I think COVID is just an opportunity, finally, maybe, to begin a movement, to begin an international political movement to shut down bioweapons research.
There was a piece in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, which has very radical beginnings, by the way. It's pretty mainstream now, but they occasionally still do worthwhile things. And they were incredibly quiet, again, the first year or so of the pandemic, or at least the first several months. But they had a piece before the pandemic, I think in 2018, that assessed the probability of a pandemic as being like 70% over the next 10 years, something like that. Incredibly high possibility of a pandemic from a lab origin. And, you know, they basically outline a thing to say, we really got to get serious about this. And look, if you really got to do some kind of lab work for some crazy ass reasons, let's fucking set up a couple of labs in Antarctica or something already. You know, you can't have these things floating around. Let's put a stop to this and figure out real, transparent way of doing work if it really needs to be done in a completely protected manner.
I think when the Republicans take control of Congress and start hauling people up, you know, in these hearings and forcing them to speak, by subpoenaing them, I think that's the moment when we have to strike then. Once the American people find out, once the world's people find out that the origin of this thing is probably in US foreign policy, which is so incredible, and bioweapons research, I think that's when we can say, hey, let's organize something. Let's close Fort Detrick right now. I mean, that should be the first thing. We should organize a movement to close Fort Detrick, don't you think?
Yeah, and there has been a long history, as you say, of activists, but they're operating at a small level doing that. I think that needs to be doubled and tripled to the nth degree. And I think it should happen right away, and hope that the Republicans do the right thing and reach out to the Republicans to get them to do the right thing and, you know, make this more of a priority than, well, you know, some other attack on Biden, which again may not be illegitimate, but this is more important right now in the future.
Now, here's the problem. How do we make it enforceable, right? We have an international government body. That may be the only way to do it, right?
It may well be the only way to do it, but let's have a serious discussion about this. I mean, somebody might have a solution to that I don't know about at this point, because, you know, this subject is so marginal and we're not talking.
Right. Exactly. Well, we are now. We're talking now. This is the beginning, sir. I do believe. And I do believe next year it's really going to take off. So I'm really glad we're doing this now, so people have this as evidence to use in their organizing. Everyone should go to Sam Husseini's Substack immediately and read it. He's got a lot of stuff on there and a lot of stuff on other foreign policy issues. He has a great recent article about Madeleine Albright's illustrious career as a mass murderer and other things. And you and I and others, we're going to start talking about really doing things on the ground, organizing a political movement. And I think this is the beginning. So thank you for doing this, sir. And thank you for all the work you've done. Thankless work. You've been shunned, dismissed, not allowed into the media, but I think times are changing.
Fully. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Great. All right. This is the Unregistered podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. To become a patron of the show and have access to bonus episodes, AMAs, and the Unreported News Analysis Show, go to patreon.com/unregistered. Thanks for listening.